Fresh and shocking footage of acts of terrorism in Xinjiang in the past 2 decades has been released in response to criticism of current prevention measures. The State Council Information Office of China has offered clear numbers to mark the progress made in Xinjiang and says that the U.S. is using double standards regarding anti-terrorism and eliminating extremism. Why does the West adopt differing standards for human rights issues with other nations and themselves? And how are proactive preventative policies paying off? And what is the situation in Xinjiang today? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Huo Zhengxin from China University of Political Science and Law and Wang Cong, reporter for the Global Times. We'll also speak via satellite with Ganbar Naderi, a columnist with Keihan International in Tehran, and Fraser Cameron, director of the EU Asia Center in Brussels. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi. All right, let's start with our guest here in Beijing. Mr. Huo, I want to start with CGTN's exclusive documentary about the fight against terrorism in Xinjiang. It has created huge waves here in China. People are shocked and disturbed by a lot of the footage shown to the public for the very first time, and given people just an idea of how violent some of these attacks were. I wonder, what are your feelings watching that documentary?
Well, as a law professor, I should say that after watching the documentary released by CGTN, I should say that the documentary provides a lot of concrete evidence to justify the Chinese policy and the measures taken in Xinjiang. The terrorist attack during 1990s till the first decade of the 21st century was rampant. So I think that each country, I should say, should take the efficient measures to fight against terrorism according to law.
Thousands of terrorist attacks in the past 30 years. Wang Cong, your reaction to the documentary?
I think for me mostly because we have heard about this incident, this incident both in Kunming, which is very close to my hometown, and also I've been traveled to Xinjiang, and we have heard the story. But seeing the footage, there are a lot of first time, like you said, fresh first time, it was first time released to the public. It is really saddening that also brings up the the reminder that it is still a threat, a risk. People living in Xinjiang still face that risk. That's why the government there in Xinjiang takes all these measures to not only stop the violence for the moment, but for the long run. So for me, I think it is a reminder that this is a serious issue that has to be taken seriously.
We have also taken notice that the international media, a lot of Western media, that in their reports have criticized China about what it has done in Xinjiang. They have not responded. They have remained rather quiet about this documentary. And it's very interesting because at a regular press briefing at the Foreign Ministry, spokesperson Hua Chunying asked foreign journalists attending the press conference, how many of you have watched this documentary? And no one raised their hands. This is according to a Global Times report. So, Wang Cong, I think this is your department. Do you think that there is media bigotry and bias when it comes to reporting on the truth in Xinjiang?
Absolutely, not just Xinjiang with China, So this is kind of the latest case where, when it comes to China, the Western media, especially those in the US and the UK, they cherry pick information that only suits the narrative, that suits them, that, anything that China does is against the law, against human rights. So that fits into their, overall narrative that, China is is not a country where, it's like the UK, US, but it's just clear double standards because they are the ones who have been reporting on Xinjiang all this time, and the officials released that that video, and then the CGTN made that documentary, but now they're kind of silent, and it is also astonishing to see that how all of them, not just one. There were some reports in the like briefs in Reuters and some media outlets, but all of them, the Washington Post, the New York Times, which have been pushing this relentlessly, have been quiet. And so it is quite astonishing, but you know, I have to say that I'm not surprised, because that's how, that is the pattern when it comes to China, everything that China touched, from Xinjiang to Hong Kong.
On the topic of double standard, do you feel that the United States has been using a double standard in judging the situation in Xinjiang, because China, as a victim of terrorism, feels that it has every right to take measures, good measures, preventative measures, to keep people safe on its own territory? That's exactly what China feels it has been doing in Xinjiang. And there you have the United States, who is also a victim of terrorism, who has done everything possible in keeping its people safe, and along the way inflicting a very high human toll and human loss. For the United States to come up and say and criticize China of what it's doing, Mr. Hua, do you feel that's a double standard on the part of the United States?
Well, before I answer your question, I'd like to add some remarks on the previous question. Well, first of all, I have to emphasize that the documentary released by CGTN is very important and positive, because there is a Chinese saying which is, rumors end when transparency is there. So I believe that this documentary makes the outside world, especially the Western world, know what happened in Xinjiang and why China take these kind of actions to fight against terrorism. I believe that the fight against terrorism in Xinjiang is a part of the fight against terrorism globally. So I think that the release of this documentary itself is very important, though, as you mentioned just some major Western media seems to be selectively blind to this documentary. Anyway, I'm not the expert in journalism, but even as a layman, I know that neutrality and importance are the most important principles of these mass medium in Western media. So I think that this selective ignorance apparently deviates these principles that these West media boast. So I think this will underline their credibility and reputation in the long run.
I see. Mr. Naderi and Terrell, let me come to you now. I want to put the same question to you. Do you feel that there is double standard on the part of the United States when judging the situation there in Xinjiang and judging what the Chinese government has been doing in Xinjiang?
Well, China is not an exception. The United States war on terror policy has been bankrupt for such a long time. They came in the name of war on terror and they destroyed Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and many other parts of the country, these countries, and they left these countries in ruins and to their own devices. So America is doing the same thing with China. They don't care if innocent women and children are being killed and maimed and injured in Xinjiang and other parts of the country in light of terrorism and extremism. They just don't care, because they don't think that the rule of law, the rule of war on terrorism also applies to China, that China has every right under international law and the UN Charter to defend itself and the basic human rights of its citizens. So the double standard has been there before all these terrorist attacks happened in China, in Xinjiang and elsewhere. We shouldn't be surprised at all.
Mr. Cameron, Mr. Naderi there seems said that this is no exception, what China has been doing in Xinjiang in fighting terrorism. In fact, China has said that in essence, its preventative measures in Xinjiang are similar to what other countries in the world have been doing in their fight against terrorism. We have the correction community in the United States, and we have learned from a report by The Guardian that there are a disengagement and desistance program in the United Kingdom where convicted terrorists live in a community. What does that tell us about the U.S. attitude towards China's measures in Xinjiang?
Well, I think, firstly, every state obviously has the right to take measures to defend its own citizens and ensure their security. Secondly, I think I would agree there's a certain measure of hypocrisy in what the United States is doing. But I think, thirdly, the criticism that you hear from some quarters in the US and Europe is simply about the degree of attempts to change minds in Xinjiang. The numbers of people that are in the sort of re-education centers is much more than one would expect given the nature of the problem. So I think it's more a question of degree than the actual trying to deal with the problem.
But would you say that preventative measures in the European experience have been valuable when it comes to preventing terrorist attacks from happening?
You can never prevent terrorist attacks 100% in a free society. It's simply impossible. You have to mobilize resources of your police, intelligence, education, social workers, etc., to try and identify where the dangers are. Increasingly, the dangers are also coming from online recruitment, and that's very, very difficult to actually monitor and deal with. The incident that there was in London just last week showed that someone was released wrongly early from prison and caused a terror attack in London Bridge. Well, these things happen. Obviously, it should not have happened if the procedures had been correctly followed. The point is there is no 100% way to actually stop terrorism.
And each country finding their own way, their best way in mobilizing the resources to keep their people safe. I want to turn back to my guests here in our Beijing studio. The United States passed this bill on Xinjiang to protect human rights. That's according to the United States. But does the U.S. have the moral high ground here to criticize China and accuse China of human rights violations? Our other guests touched down on this a little bit earlier, saying that the U.S. military interventions in the Middle East have left a high human toll there in the region. So what do you think? Does the United States have the moral high ground here?
Well, in my eyes, I believe that for some American political elites, they believe they have a natural sense of superiority. They believe that the system different from theirs should be bad or even evil. Therefore, although Chinese constitution also guarantee that the protection of basic human rights, they believe because the Chinese system is different from theirs, therefore they take it for granted that the Chinese system that did not pay respect to human rights. And then, or in other words, they are not ready to understand China in an equal way, and then gradually they lose the capacity to treat China objectively and equally.
Does the U.S. hold itself to the same level it holds China, Mr. Wang?
I think for me that's a little bit meaningless to discuss if the United States has the moral high ground, because that's not where it comes from. It says that it wants to protect human rights in Xinjiang, which but in fact that is not the intention, because we have to see all this, whether it's Xinjiang or Hong Kong, we have to see this within the broader perspective of the China-U.S. relationship, where a competition, a rivalry is shaping up, mostly because of the hostility out of Washington. So we have to see this Xinjiang bill through that view. So what they're trying to do is not about human rights, because if they really care about human rights, they would not pass such a law, because what China is doing there, preventing terrorist attacks, or helping the local population to have a better life, to improve their life. That's the best human rights. So I don't want to even focus on that, because we all have established that the hypocrisy, the double standard the U.S. applies. But what I want to stress is these kind of things, they're small, because from the Chinese perspective, whether they will watch these documentaries or not, whether they will report on it or not, whether the United States Congress will pass this law, that does not change anything. Because we will take whatever it takes to prevent these attacks, these heinous attacks, and to protect the citizen. That does not change. However, these small things, these narratives, these accusations will accumulate, and then to a very dangerous point, because we know that how the U.S. Media played in the role in the field foreign policy over the last decades, in Vietnam, in Iraq, the New York Times, how the media played a role in pushing the narrative that there is weapons of mass destruction. And then years later, the war is still there. The people are hurt, but those are built by these small narratives. So that's what I really want to focus on and what they're doing.
Do you think the U.S. media is again pushing the agenda of the U.S. government?
I think definitely, because how it works, that is, you know, the U.S. government to promote their foreign policy, they will target it. They will release, you know, some information, you know, they're called sources, you know, information to discredit the, you know, the country, or, you know, even demonize the country. That's the first step before the, you know, they wage a broader war, you know, against that country. So we're seeing this pattern. You know, we don't really, it's not about, oh, we're not happy because you don't report on this, but we're saying this is a dangerous pattern that we have seen many, many times, and people, you know, both people in the Middle East, in Vietnam, people in America have been hurt by these mistakes, this pattern. So we have to be very, you know, aware of that, and that's what we want to focus on. With regards to the, you know, moral high ground, nobody, when it comes to terrorism, nobody holds higher, higher moral ground in this, because this is against human rights.
When it comes to different narratives of what human rights means for people in different countries, Mr. Hua, do you also think that it comes down to different understandings of human rights? Because in China, when people talk about human rights, they talk about walking down the street, feeling safe, not having to worry about being attacked by radicals. They talk about their economic and educational opportunity, which all of this is being provided in Xinjiang as we take notice. Do you think that it's also a different understanding that has caused those different narratives?
Well, I should say that the human rights are protected by both American law and the Chinese law. And I believe that both countries share some similarities with regard to the understanding of the human rights. But differences is always apparent. For instance, as you mentioned just now, China believes that the economic rights, the rights of substance, is the most important human rights. If people were starved to death, how we talk about human rights. Therefore, China believes that providing economic prosperity and safety is the most important types of human rights. Human rights is product of history, culture, and religion. So Chinese government believes that there's no uniform or standard answer to human rights. Each country should respect the notions of human rights of the others. Mutual respect and understanding is very important.
And Mr. Naderi, let me turn to you now. China says this is a gross interference of its domestic affairs, calling the U.S. bill on Xinjiang a gross interference. Pragmatically, what does this bill possibly achieve for the United States? What does this bill make the United States look like?
Well, the U.S. Government's foreign policy has been bankrupt for such a long time. The whole idea, the whole intention behind, you know, coming up with any kind of accusations against China in Xinjiang is to put further pressure on China during the upcoming or during the ongoing trade negotiations between the Chinese and American delegates. That's one idea. The other idea is to distract attention from America's own poor human rights records, not just inside the American soil, but also across the globe, especially in the Middle East. America doesn't like attention when it comes to its, you know, poor human rights records. So why not create a scapegoat like China and distract attention, global attention towards China and specifically towards Xinjiang? That's another one. But the most important idea, the most important intention is to prevent China's growing progress in technology, in economy, and so on. China is the second biggest economy in the world, and it is soon going to replace America as #1 global economy. So America is desperate. Some European countries are desperate to make sure that China doesn't become #1 global economy in the very, very near future. So the whole idea is to prevent China's growing capabilities and, of course, growth. That's why they are posing accusation against China. That's why they are desperate to make sure that the international community would not endorse what China is doing humanely and fairly in places like Xinjiang. Remember, with all due respect to your distinguished guests, what China is doing now, what Europe is doing now is exactly what China has been doing for more than 2-3 years. Years ago. They are imitating, they are exactly following the re-engagement program that China has successfully implemented over the past 3 years or so. They have just begun to re-engage and to re-educate their former ISIS or terrorist citizens. So the program, re-education program in Xinjiang has been a great success, and the witness and the evidence for that is that Europe and America are following the same pattern and program. So I think we should give China the credit that it deserves and not criticize its humane and fair policy with regard to educating its fanatics and those who have, the serious problem with terrorism and extremism in Xinjiang and beyond.
Mr. Cameron, I have a feeling that you won't agree 100% with our guest there. In Tehran, what do you think passing this bill on Xinjiang does for the United States?
Well, I think to some extent it makes them sort of feel good that they're doing something. It's a lot to do with the people pushing it, people like Pompeo, who obviously is using this as partly as a campaign issue for his run for the US Senate, Mike Pence, who's playing to the conservative base. So there's a bit of internal domestic politics. I don't think Trump cares very much about what's happening in Xinjiang or anywhere else in terms of human rights. He's not that interested in it. And I don't think it's a major factor also in the US-China trade dispute. I think it's, as I say, just basically to show themselves feeling good. It's not going to have a really big impact. I can see why China is annoyed about it. But as I said earlier, there is no easy solution. Certainly the Americans haven't found it, Europeans haven't found it, to actually dealing with terrorists. You are dealing often with single individuals who suddenly get radicalized as a result of either a personal experience or something that's seen online, or perhaps the nature of the war, and that suddenly creates a spark, and it's very difficult to identify that. So I say lots of people are just trying now to find out the best way, but there is no single way to deal with terrorism.
If there's not going to be a huge impact on the ongoing trade negotiations, what could be a possible fallout, Mr. Cameron, of mixing policy with politics?
I think the U.S. administration can separate them quite well. I mean, Trump, I think he reluctantly signed the bill, said, I don't want to upset my friendship with Xi Jinping here, and I think I might use my presidential prerogatives to limit the damage here. So he was obviously reluctant to do that. But it gives the U.S. Congress the alibi that they've actually been doing something simply by passing this. The reality is it will not have any serious operational impact on U.S.-China relations.
All right, we don't have a lot of time left here on the broadcast. I want to briefly talk to the both of you about a phenomenon that was included in that CGTN documentary about the situation in Xinjiang. Social media is now being used to spread a radical and extremist ideology. What can people do? What can countries in the world do together in containing that?
Okay, I think that internet or cyberspace pose a lot of challenge to the human order in today's world, especially the fight against terrorism, I think. So I should say the immediate action should be taken at two different levels. At domestic levels, each country should, legislate to regulate cyberspace in order to make sure that the cyberspace is not a lawless space. For instance, China enacted its cybersecurity law in the year of 2016, which efficiently checked the terrorism by the internet spread. At the international level, as you know, that internet is borderless. Therefore, no single country can address this challenge by its own. Therefore, I believe that every country and international community at large should cooperate each other to build and enhance the international law regime of cyberspace in order to address this challenge, which is a common challenge.
Where does the responsibility fall, Mr. Wan? Does it fall on the government side? Does it fall on individual social media networks and platforms?
I think this is kind of the debate of the day, right? You know, we have seen this in the United States Congress, also, you know, discussing about the information on the social media platforms. You know, they are planning on some regulations on how information is spread out on Facebook or Twitter, for example. So when it comes to China, you know, again, when they talk about the human rights and the freedom from expression, they often, you know, cite the regulations in China about, you know, spreading information online. That's kind of their argument that, you know, oh, there's no freedom of expression. But then that's where this comes into play, because cyber, you know, that is the biggest tool to get information, but that can also be the biggest tool to spread, you know, misinformation or radical ideas. And we have seen this around the world, that, you know, people are now radicalized by just watching or reading online. So that is also a real challenge in China, and there have to be, you know, I think, yes, the companies, the platforms have to take certain you know, measures to prevent that, but ultimately this is a security issue, right? So it falls on the government to take, you know, proper regulations to stop this, to stop the spread of these radical ideas and these misinformation. So I think also I want to, you know, like Mr. Cameron said, there's no single way to you know, prevent this terrorism, and it is incredibly challenged because of all the, you know, the characteristics. However, that is the point. We all, you know, like you know, we all have to deal with this, and then there have to be different measures, different solutions. So we all have to try. What you can't do is, you know, to stand up and criticize the others and say, oh, you can't do that. Everybody is trying. China is trying. China is not saying our, you know, program is perfect, but we're trying, you know, we're trying that to make a long-term investment in that, to change, you know, this generation, you know, to be free from radical ideas. That is what China is trying. Not, you know, we're not saying it's perfect. Nobody's saying that.
I hear you, Mr. Cameron. I think we all agree when you said that there's no way to prevent terrorism 100%, as Mr. Wan here in my studio pointed out. But modern-day threats, including the spread of ideology on social media and in social media spheres, is a serious problem. Your take on how to prevent that, and joint efforts from multiple fronts in multiple countries?
I don't think anybody knows. I mean, it's a phenomenon of the last sort of decade or so, the spread of fake news plus radical ideologies on social media. And obviously, people are trying to establish how best to do this by monitoring, but there's so many different accounts that come up. It's very, very difficult to do. But allied to this is a question of funding. There's evidence now of substantial funding coming from the Middle East. You know, we know the Saudis have been very active in this, and other Gulf states, providing money for new mosques, for new Islamic charities, which obviously are often a cover for radical activity. So I think we've got to look for the money as well as the social media angle.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have on our broadcast today. I want to say thank you to all four of my guests today for your input and your analysis. Thank you so much. And that is The Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching.